Do that. Okay, one second. Dearest friends, I'm now going to, no, before I do that, actually, I'm going to do something different tonight. And I apologize in advance for those of you that are not dramatically different, but I apologize for you watching on a non-computer. But I want this to be a bit of a discussion and interactive, and I'm really getting fed up of doing this on Zoom. And we are going to slowly and hopefully in November move this into the shul where you can all come and shout at me and with me.
Good.
If everyone just mutes for now, though, that would be really helpful. Just for a moment, if you want to say anything, unmute yourself. So I'm going to try something different. Unlike every other show I've given in COVID, I'm not going to share my screen. What I'm doing is when we start with the sources, I'm going to put them in the chat and you can all download them. But I'm also not going to go through the sources in tremendous. We're not going to learn lots of sources together. I will mention them out. Let's just get everyone muted. Thank you very much. So I imagine that you all read the title, so you know why you're here. And this just as by means of introduction, just over the years that I've been in Belmont, I mean, we've done studies in the Parasha weekly, we've done studies in Tanakh, we've done studies in sort of contemporary halachic issues, we've done Shabbat, we've done, I think my parents who aren't on, yeah, it's quite late in Israel, they requested more, my mum wanted some more, like, Rabbi, I've trafed up my kitchen. She asked me to do a couple more of those, so I was thinking maybe we'll revisit that in the new secular year potentially. But just something that maybe some topics that I thought were of interest to me and maybe of you is look at some ethical issues. And I thought we're better to start than looking at the halachic implications and ethical issues around. If you're not muted, please do so. Just to keep it all nice and quiet. Halachic issues around. Come on, guys, we can all mute. Halachic issues around, because you know me, I lose focus if you know. Halachic issues around COVID trials for vaccinations, or not just COVID, any kind of trial. I'm going to explain what I mean. I'm going to attempt to explain what I mean now, actually. So let's start with this. I'm going to build a scenario, and as you'll see on the source sheet, I've actually given you a couple of links to articles that actually deal with this practically. So my basic understanding of how this works, and then we'll discuss what the ethical implications will be. But the basic understanding is you have a virus. So we've got COVID SARS-19, right? So you have a virus, and you want to try and create a vaccination to stop people from getting this virus. So not a cure, but a vaccination. And the way you do that is you use the scientists who do all their knowledge and research, and they build cultures and this and that, and they, in the laboratory, will come up with what they believe is something that is safe and at a position that it's ready to trial on a real person, right? So what happens up until this point, it's got nothing to do with me, and I know nothing about it. And even though I've read a bit, I'm not even going to attempt to discuss it. If Barbara or anyone else that thinks they know can explain that another time, that's great. But at this point, we're talking at a point where we have actual vaccination, a substance that the scientists, the doctors, the professors, the researchers believe can work safely on human beings. So therefore want to enter into a trial system, or a challenge, I think it's called, Barbara, right? It's a challenge. So what they do is they get a group of people together. Now, it's really important that we understand this. Again, this is my understanding. The people or the candidates that they get together have to be people that they themselves would be at low risk of infection or serious illness if they were to get the virus. Now, because obviously we have to be very careful, we were playing with people's lives here. So let's take COVID, for example. COVID, because we're living in it, right? COVID is very new, and they've rushed through almost miraculously the vaccination program, which apparently takes a lot longer, and maybe you know much more about this than I do. Can take years to develop these things. They've done it in about 18 months, I think, or less, actually. They did it in about a year. So everything is quite risky at the moment. But essentially, to do these trials, they get a small group of people together who are relatively low risk. So that's going to have to do with age, that's going to have to do with general health, that's going to have to do with susceptibility to becoming sick about other things, all those things. And also, I also believe it has to be someone that would be likely to become or affected or sick from COVID itself. So, for example, in an area where there's busy people, let's say London, where you're going to come into contact with COVID or the virus that you're looking to try and vaccinate from. So you're someone who's naturally going to be at risk. Therefore, if you're getting it now, you're probably going to have got it anyway. And also low risk in terms of consequences. So once you've got your candidates, what you do is you give a section of this challenge of the study. You inject them with the vaccination that you have cultivated, and the rest get the placebo, right? So they get the nothing. That's what you do. So you give now a period of time that the vaccination has an opportunity to work based on what you think and what they projected it will take to work, whether that's a few days or however long it is. And then, and this is what I'm pretty sure is going to happen, you inject everyone with a very small amount of the virus. Okay, Barbara, you have to stop me if I'm saying something wrong. This, maybe you don't know, okay, but this is my understanding, right? This is my little bit of research that I've done into this to understand what the issues are. Bless you. So, a group of people are being tested. A number of them have the vaccine. A number of them don't. Everyone now has the virus, because if you're not putting the virus in, you've got nothing to check anyway. And when we say putting the virus in, they're not getting like a huge amount. They're getting small enough amount of the virus that it will be able to have an effect on the system, but small enough that it won't be hopefully a dramatic effect. So you don't want to give someone a lot of COVID, because that could be very serious and very dangerous. So everyone's now exposed to the virus, and then they are watched, monitored, given the best care, given the best resources, and therefore are studied to see what happens. This is my basic understanding, very, very basic understanding of what a COVID vaccination challenge is. You're infecting people with the virus. So my first question is that A, ethical in itself? B, is that, and this is what we're going to look at today from a Jewish perspective, is a Jew allowed to volunteer for such a thing? So they're my initial questions. Because again, everyone is now going to be infected with a virus. And we know that, especially from the early days, how sick even people that aren't vulnerable and are healthy can get from this virus, and how dangerous the virus is. So that's the first question. Is that ethical to do? Is that allowed to do? Why would it be allowed to? Why would it be allowed to do it? To actually knowingly infect someone with a dangerous disease? And then also, what would the Jewish perspective be? Any thoughts and any initial thoughts or comments? And what we're going to do today is look at some of the thinking behind why it might be wrong or right, and how we get to a conclusion. And I think David Lerner's waving at me. So David, unmute thyself and have a say, please.
Thank you. Given the possibility that the millions of deaths can arise, it would seem to me that it's reasonable to expose a small number of people to a risk, although it can go wrong. Norfolk Park did a clinical trial on something a few years ago, and it came very close to killing a few people.
Right.
But nevertheless, the potential is saving millions of lives. It is essential that Jews participate for two completely separate reasons. Number one, it's possible that there's a genetic impact of vulnerability that makes some people more vulnerable than others. And as we have a different gene pool to a degree than some other groups, unless we participate, we won't know if we're going to be secure. Number one. Number two, from the perspective of Kiddush Hashem and Hillel Hashem, it would be outrageous for us to be prepared to take the benefit of, if it's really risky, of non-Jews getting risked, but we're going to be okay, Jack. So I think there would be two broad issues. One is a medical one, one is the broader sociological one.
Thank you for your input. I'll just comment briefly on both of those. Number one, I hadn't thought of the first one, which is the sort of gene pool. As Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews, we have a somewhat different genetic build. As we know, there are some viruses, some horrendous genetic diseases that seem to travel through the Jewish communities, which are less likely in other communities. And that's why the charities like genetics are essential and important, that we get people tested and we understand how that works. So I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. On the second one, it's really interesting what you're saying. Firstly, if it's asur, if it's prohibited, then although you might be right from an emotional perspective, asur is asur. The Kiddush Hashem element shouldn't be the reason to do it, even though that's an important factor. But I'll change it over. For example, when they first started, I believe, organ donation trials with live organs, the rabbis in that time told Jews they were not allowed to participate in the trials. I believe that's true, which is probably one of the first areas where this kind of conversation has come up, because I'm just trying to think of sort of a modern day example. Okay, when there are other things like smallpox, and we're going back hundreds of years, they had various methods which Jews partook in, but again, probably based on different things. But when it was a real unknown, like the organ donations, I don't believe Jews were allowed to participate. Now, you could use your same argument and say, well, you could benefit from it, so why would you not allowed to be in the trials? Which is a very, very important ethical, moral discussion to have. But if it's asur, if it's prohibited, then we're going to struggle to allow it just on the basis. So maybe the answer is we don't take them. But we can't allow someone just because it looks bad if it's not allowed. David, do you want to come back on that, and I'll ask anyone else if they have any comments?
We are prohibited from going into churches, but the chief rabbis have always gone into churches for sociological reasons.
Well, I've explained that before. Firstly, not all the chief rabbis have, and I'll give you the classic example that we heard from Rabbi Sachs, the Rabbonim. He told the Rabbonim this a number of years ago. Blessed memory, I think I did it in the Q&A once, that when it came to Margaret Thatcher's funeral procession, she had requested Rabbi Sachs be involved and be there. That was something very specific. And when he got the invitation from the Margaret Thatcher's office, he had to basically say, I can't attend the service unless I'm ordered to come by the Queen, because if the monarch orders you to go, you know that's life and death. So there's a gun to your head. So miraculously, he had a letter from St. James's or from whoever it was, and the secretary of the Queen, telling him that he had to attend that. There are, yeah.
Do we change places?
So yes. So you want to? Is that fair enough? Meaning, there's Kiddush Hashem. Okay, but in such, I think what I'm trying to say is that if there are ways around it, so we cannot make a chilul Hashem. So yes, we look for ways around it. But when it's asur, it's asur. When it's prohibited, it's prohibited. So I hear the argument, and again, there are things in Torah that challenge me and my moral compass, where the two will literally collide. I don't want to get into it all now because it's not our topic for this evening, but there are things that genuinely hurt me because I'm conflicted with my own moral compass and how I feel and think about a particular topic or scenario or situation. And yet Torah gives me a big no, not allowed. So there I have to follow Torah because, I'm all in. that's not just my job, that's my life, right? I'm all in for that. But it doesn't mean that I struggle with it. Sometimes no has to be no. I remember when Lisa and I had a particular issue a good number of years ago. We only just got married, and it was all to do with a friend of the family, and we needed to do something, whatever. And we needed to make certain efforts, and we had to we wanted to not bend the rules, but we were looking for every which way avenue to basically find loopholes to be able to do something for someone else because of this Kiddush Hashem idea. We wanted a big Kiddush Hashem. And the Rav we spoke to at the time said at the end of the day, we'll do our best to try and find you a way of being able to do this. But there's a bottom line. Shulchan Aruch, Torah, sometimes there's lines we just can't cross, whether we want to or not, whether we feel it or not, because we have lines and we have a Messiah, we have a tradition. So these are the glasses that I need to look at this topic with. Of course, emotionally, everything you said, there's millions of people out there that can be affected by this. And if I can do something about that, I want to jump in, both feet forward and be able to do something. But we have to understand what the Torah has to say about such things. Anyone else got any suggestions to this interesting topic? Go on, Carol. Unmute yourself though. If you hear music in the background, I think the cantorials are
Okay,
rehearsing.
you're unmuted. You're unmuted.
Okay. Right. It's not something I've usually broadcast, but I have an incurable autoimmune disease. And over the years, I've done many tests for different trials. And I think one of the reasons I'm here today is because of some of the injections, some of the IVs, some of the pills that I have taken. And I think one of the other things, if you have a good quality of life, then you want to try and prolong it. And if there's something that can keep you going. When I was diagnosed, which was a long time ago, I was told my prognosis was 5 years. Well, that was 79, in 1979. So the reason that I'm so for this is because the drugs that they test are the ones, well, for cancer, for HIV. There are so many things now. And if people aren't willing to try, I'm not saying that somebody perfectly healthy should have all these things put into them. But if you're in a position as I was, then yeah, go for it, go ahead.
Carol,
That's
firstly, on behalf of everyone here, just thank you for sharing, number one, and we all appreciate that. And you are enabling us to add a very real element to this, and we really appreciate that. I think it's really important also that we separate. In fact, I'm actually going to come up. One of the sources I've got is sort of touching on what you said about taking and experimenting with what doctors are trying to suggest in order to make us healthy, and medicines, because who says you can take medicines? I mean, we're not going to get into the whole topic, but who says a person can take medicine? But we'll get there. We'll get there in a second. But also, I think it's important that we realize that the conversation today, specifically, broadly, but specifically, is about a healthy person being infected with a disease and the ethical implications and halachic implications that follow that, which is somewhat different from trialing and people that have offered to give plasma, people that have offered to go for regular testing, serology tests, blood tests throughout COVID. That's very, very different, because we're taking part in research, which is essential. We should all, be prepared to do our bit for that. And that's why all of us, or many of us, I'm sure, downloaded the app at the time, so we could make sure that the contact tracing was on, and we could make sure we're doing our bit. So that's all very important. And also what you're going through, and unimaginable and almost miraculous from what you said. And thank you for sharing, and thank you for being a part of what is an essential part of this conversation. Anyone else got Ivor, how are you doing? It's nice to see your whole face. Usually we just get to see this part of you when you speak.
Right. It's more a question, right, than actually. Is there a conflict between halacha and human technical progress, which is God-given? In the sense of, if we are, medical progress, if we are always doing that, right, and we now get to the stage where we can do these tests and do these trials, is there a conflict with halacha that is advised a long time ago? I'm sorry if that's a sort of strange way of putting it, but...
Are you saying that is there a conflict between halachic authorities that said this kind of medication, for example, is not allowed, with the reality of, well, today we're doing these things, and
yes,
we have technology and science that we just didn't
progress.
have.
Yes.
So if I've understood the question, and if I answer it, it's an excellent question. I'm going to come back to that, because I think one of the sources is going to touch on that. I've just put into the chat the sources. I want to see your faces. So if you want to follow along, I think there's about 10 sources there. We're not really going to read them like we would in a normal share, because I want to listen to more discussion. But I am going to, if you want to look, it's there in the chat. and you can just download it and have a look at that. But I'm going to say it all outside and go through those quite quickly so we can have the discussions. I want to start with this idea of self-endangerment. What does the Torah say about me putting myself at risk? Because that's the first part of this argument. Me, or a person volunteering to be infected with COVID SARS-19 is 100% putting themselves at risk. And who says I can do that? Can I do that? Am I allowed to do that, right? And there are people around this table that have seen firsthand how serious, damaging, and life-threatening COVID is. And we know that, right? We know this. And we go from, obviously, either, every day, Baruch Hashem, it's Kanai Nahora. It's incredible to see you and smiling and everything. And we were with you with Tefillot so many days. I know what it was like to watch. I was able to watch my wife being carted off in an ambulance who was not as sick as you, but was all very serious. And some of, we all have friends that are still getting COVID. I was chatting to someone who's not even 30, who last month got COVID. He's lost his smell and has lost his taste. And who knows if he's going to get them back. So again, serious things. And that's less life-threatening, but you see there's something happening that we don't know a lot about COVID yet. So these are all factors to bear in mind. So if you look at the sheet on the first source, I just actually put in a couple of links to some of the universities. So you've got Imperial and also Oxford University, both who in these last 6 months are doing very small challenge trials, less about the vaccination and more about giving candidates, actually giving them some of the virus and tracking how their body deals with the virus and following along from there. Okay, so they're just interesting if you want to read something small about that. Was the first source. The second source is from Yitzhak Zilberstein, and he's an interesting Rav to listen to because he's Baruch Hashem. He should be alive. He's alive. He should be healthy and well. He's a Rav, but he's also the Rav of one of the hospitals in Bnei Brak. So he's so someone just asked where the source is. They're in the chat. The problem is if you miss it, I'll add it again. So oh no, that's going to, they're not there because I had the wrong setting. The sources are here. There you go. If you want to see the sources. Thank you, Viv. Sorry about that. I had the wrong setting. So if you want to have a look, so that's the first two is a couple of links. Have a look. Second source is Rav Yitzhak Zilberstein, who is the Rav of one of the big hospitals in Bnei Brak. And I'll just read the English. And he writes, this is something so important. He quotes Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, who was known as the Brisker Rav. So we're going back a couple of 100 years to one of the most prominent and prolific Rabbonim in Europe. So the Brisker Rav told a doctor that saving a life is not specifically the case of someone who is now dangerously ill and will die, even where the fast, because we're talking about Yom Kippur in that context, even where the fast will affect him in years later, when the disease will reoccur, is also a danger to life. And so fasting now will cause him to die early. This is saving a life. Meaning what Rav Zilberstein is saying is someone who is not necessarily ill now, but is vulnerable, in danger of being ill or sick, and therefore fasting now will have an effect on their system that will affect them in the future that could cause them to die early. This is as if he's saving his life now by eating, which is fascinating. If a lot of the teshuvot, a lot of the psak halacha that came out, like what to do practical halacha, especially when COVID first started in the first year, when there was so little known about it at the beginning. So the first fast that came up that was major was Tisha B'Av. So COVID started really, lockdown was the end of March and Tisha B'Av would have been in July or something, and beginning of August, end of July. And the Rabbonim were coming out with a lot of, Tisha B'Av, quite a heavy fast, right? It's quite a long, heavy fast and also very serious. I mean, there's serious reasons to fast and serious reasons if you can't fast. And a lot of them were coming out, if you have COVID, even if you don't have symptoms, but you've got COVID, you should not fast. Why? Because you might feel fine now and you might not feel like your life is at risk now, but but the fact that we don't know what COVID is doing to you at this particular moment, one second, takes a photo. Someone sent me a message. Are the sources not working? Has anyone managed to download the sources? It should just be, okay, great. What they're saying, so even though you might not be at risk now, putting yourself in certain risk for future is also called pikuach nefesh, is also called at risk. There is a fascinating set of books called Shut Mima Amakim. I think I've quoted it before. It was by a Rav Oshri, by Rav Ephraim Oshri, who only died in 2003. He's a Holocaust survivor. He was a Rav in Lithuania, and he was a rabbi. So people were coming and asking him shilas. They were asking him questions. And you can imagine a shaila, a question, amidst the Holocaust. And one of the questions, I'll never forget, one of the questions he was asked by a group of factory workers in one of the ghettos. And they were starving, but those factory workers were taken on a walk, and they were on the way to their factory. They would stop off and be given a small amount of hot soup in order to give them koyach, to give them energy in order to work in the factory. And this was at a time where they weren't healthy, but their lives weren't hanging on a shoestring, right? They weren't hanging on a thread at that moment, but things were also very serious. And they went to Rav Oshri and said, listen, every day we go and we give in this soup. The soup is treif. It's mama's treif. It was, I think, whatever, I haven't got it in front of me, actual treif. Can we eat the soup? Now, if we don't eat the soup, we'll still make it through the day and back to the ghetto in the evening to eat in the evening, but we don't know what food that's going to be. And Rav Oshri said, you have to eat the treif there and then, because you don't know where really the next day's food's going to come from. We don't know what's happening yesterday, today, tomorrow. We're in a situation of pikuach nefesh. So even though eating the treif now won't save your life today, because of what's going to almost certainly happen over the next coming days, weeks, months, and the uncertainty behind it, you have to eat the treif now. So there is a klal, a principle that we have to do everything we can to save lives. Even if your life isn't in danger now, this moment, you have to do whatever you can thinking into the future. And that's why when it comes to things like fasting and Yom Kippur, as I've explained, as Rav Zilberstein explains, these things are very taken into account. Even if you're feeling, okay, I could fast now, But if it's got a serious danger to your life, but what's going to happen, that has to be taken into account. And as I said, if there's anything practical, then I'm always happy to talk about it, just to show you. Now, both Carol and I have touched upon this idea of sort of taking medication and what that does. Now, Rav, in source number 3, the Sitz Eliezer, Rav Waldenberg, so was also a phenomenal halachic poisek. So he wrote books and books and books of contemporary halachic issues. And he writes, and I'm just going to quote the English, as the common denominator among the views cited is in a particular topic, I don't want to get into it now, is that long as the doctor intends to heal via medical methods he possesses, he is permitted to do so. Meaning, you can go and see a doctor, according to Torah law, even if these are new advances in medicine, and even if the medicine, the medication, the treatments is in some way at risk or risky, it's a mitzvah to go to that doctor and for him to treat the patient via the accepted medical approaches. Meaning, even if any kind of treatment, any kind of medication, anything that you put in your body, there's always going to be a risk. I don't know if any of you have ever read the possible side effects in paracetamol, right? Or Nurofen, or Panadol, right? A few hands going up, yeah. Don't read them, or maybe do read them, right? But like, you're putting something into your body that can lead to quite serious side effects. Now, when you pop a couple of paracetamol or Panadol, Nurofen, whatever it is, most of us are willing to. The headache's bad enough that I'm willing to pop the pills in order that whatever side effects that doesn't normally happen, and even if it did happen, it's better than not having the headache. But then there's a certain amount of, let's say, you take a step up to antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, whatever it might be. And I'm sure the list goes on and on and on, where the side effects get longer and longer and longer, and the risks become longer and longer and longer and more serious and more, we have to take note, which is why obviously you have to be careful what you eat and drink along with, and when you eat and drink along with certain medication. So what Rav Wallenberg, but the Sitz Eliezer is saying, listen, there's always going to be a risk when taking medication or treatments. However, one has to have understanding of what the risks are before going into an endeavor. I would say that Tzitzei Eliezer is going to tell us if there's some experimental treatment that goes and defies what mainstream medical practice allows, he would say that's risky and hesitant. He would say it'd be risky and probably problematic in halacha. Why? Because one should understand what the doctors are saying to the best of their knowledge and trust in the doctors as much as we can. Source 4 is Rav Reisha. Rav Reisha wrote a responsa in 17th century Prague. So we're going back a few hundred years, even though we've gone to more recent ones. But what he's saying is very important. Again, I'll just read the English in source 4. He says, in the case in which they're discussing, again, I don't want to go into the specifics of the case, but the principles are important. In this case, since he will certainly die, he's talking about someone who is going to die, and yet there is potentially life-saving treatment. So in the case of certainty, without the treatment, he's going to die, we leave the certainty and take the possibility that the treatment might help him to become healed. Still, the doctor should not simply proceed with this. He must be very patient, checking the local expert doctors and deciding based on the majority of views, meaning a recognizable majority, which is okay. Therefore, he should follow the majority of medical opinions and the agreement of the leading local authority. So halachic authorities are telling us you can put yourself to some kind of risk when it's a medical issue, but the risk has to be measured and it has to be with advice and it has to be balanced rather than being irresponsible and rather being, again, we're talking life and death being one level, and we're talking about sort of everyday living at another level, right? And everyone's got to have seichel and understanding. But I suppose what I'm trying to draw out of this is, it's not poshut. When it comes to protecting our lives, when it comes to taking risks, Chazal are telling us, the rabbis are telling us, zelo pashut. We have a responsibility to live through the mitzvahs. V'chai bohem, the pasuk says, the verse says, you have to live through the mitzvahs, and you can't take unnecessary risks. And therefore, every time there's a risk involved, one has to be measured, thought out, and understood in knowing what that risk is. And if we plug that back into the COVID vaccine, where there is such an unknown, right? Based on what I've said and how I've presented it, is it permissible to volunteer for a COVID trial? From what I've said, we haven't finished yet, right? Just from how I presented it, from an individual basis. I'm not asking you, would you do it? I'm asking from the sensitivities, how the halachas seem to be writing these comments, is it permissible to partake in COVID trials? Anyone there? Great, don't have to answer. Salvador, go for it.
Yes, the way that you presented, Rabbi, a healthy person being injected with the virus to follow some kind of trial is a significant risk.
Oh, and I think that's the key. There is a significant risk, even if the person themselves is in a lower percentile of risk because they're healthy. We've all seen healthy people get very sick, correct?
The emphasis is on a healthy individual.
The emphasis is on a healthy individual, but still a healthy individual, this could be a risk. Now, if we take what Rav Reisha just said, you know, or even what Rav Zilberstein said, talking about understanding the risk and understanding the level of knowledge that we have around the risks and around the symptoms and the effects, it sounds to me that it's not so simple that you can just volunteer for a trial. But of course, we haven't finished yet, and there are other factors. And I've just seen it's already quite late, and I don't want to, you know, I find it really hard sitting concentrating on a screen. So I can only imagine. I'm talking now, so I'm wide awake and I'm going for it. Right? I can't imagine. I want to keep you guys. I want to give you some to keep us all together. So I'm going to kind of if you have the sheets, the Gemara in source 5 is interesting because it's not talking about vaccines or medicine. It's talking about putting a person. Can a person be at risk? Put themselves at risk for parnasa. It's talking about wage laborers. Sorry, that put themselves at risk by hanging up, by climbing trees and doing all these chores, and you know, and they have to be paid on time. And it's talking about putting yourself at risk, but not necessarily for medical reasons, just for financial reasons, for the right thing. Can you think of anyone in Tanakh that put themselves at risk? There's a couple of obvious ones. Some, I'll give you a clue. She put her life on the line for the community, for all of Israel. Anyone? Esther, beautiful. Thank you, Lynn. Esther Hamalka, right? So here's Queen Esther, and she sees that Klal Yisrael are in danger. And in her case, in her scenario, it's almost certain danger, because she could see Haman and she understood, and Mordechai understood. Excuse me. So what does she do? She puts herself in the line then. She puts herself directly in harm's way in order to influence the situation, in order to save Klal Yisrael, which she manages to do. So the next stage of this discussion is, we've only spoken on an individual level. Can I, as a person, for me, even if there's a greater need or cause, which we're going to talk about, but can I take medicine? Can I do things for myself that are risky, i.e., can I put myself in danger for the right reasons? That's what we've been talking about. Now we're talking about, can I do it if there's a greater need, a societal need? Because I think what we can see is, actually, there's a much more of a broader perspective, and therefore maybe more leniencies or more leeways, I should say, when it comes to halacha. So the next source, if you've got it, the one I want to do is, I'm going to skip out source 6. That's Rav Yisraeli, also a slightly more 20th century rabbi. And again, I realize I haven't brought the clearest part of what his piece was. He's talking about a discretionary war. Let's say Israel, right? The land of Israel, and they have a king. Can the king take Israel to war? Obviously, war, putting lives at risk, not because they've been attacked, but because they want to extend the borders of Israel, because there's profit there. Can they do it? And the answer is yes. A king can take his nation to war for the good of the nation, and people are expected to put their lives in harm's way because they're fighting the war. So that's a simple case of war, right? If you look at source 7, if you've got the sheet, although I'm just going to read it out anyway, but listen to what Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach lived in Shari Chesed in Jerusalem. And we've often speak about Rav Moshe Feinstein in America. Rav Moshe was the Rav Moshe, and he gives us so much of our psak halacha and understanding today, and we rely on him for so many things. His contemporary in Israel is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he writes, although a discretionary war, which is just for profit, even the king cannot take the nation to war without the Sanhedrin, so he can't just do it on his own. He needs to do it with the knowledge of the sages at the time. But still, if he does it and the sages give him permission, it's for a mitzvah and the war is allowed. When the community is pursued by bears and lions, i.e. they're under attack, and they need to fight and chase them out, perhaps aside from the fact this is considered life-saving, and there is a mitzvah for each person to desecrate Shabbat to save lives, perhaps this is also considered a mitzvah war. We're going to get to the bit I want. Although we lack a king today or a court, still, the town council can compel and endanger the lives of individuals, as with war, even where an individual would not be obligated to save lives. Meaning, an authoritative figure like a king or a bet din or a town council, where there is a need for the community to put themselves at risk, even though an individual themselves at that moment might not be at risk, they can compel someone to protect the local community. And if we are correct in this, then perhaps, listen to what he says, then perhaps war against illness, which lie in wait for people as well, would be a mitzvah war. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach something so phenomenal and so insightful, and Baruch Hashem, we have the wisest of sages, because in our heart of hearts, all of us want to say, of course, we have to volunteer for vaccine trials. But what he's doing, he's giving us the Torah perspective and understanding of how we should view what it is to stand up and say, I will volunteer to volunteer for a vaccine trial. He's saying it's literally a soldier fighting a war. And a soldier fighting a war that is compelled to go to fight in a war, as he's saying, isn't in that moment at risk. I'm not at risk. If I get conscripted into the army, or if I get called up in the Miluim in Israel, right? So Miluim is reserve duty, but then you can get called up. In the moment you're getting called up, you yourself are not at risk. But when you go to fight, because you are compelled to fight, it becomes a mitzvah because you're protecting the borders of Israel and the people of Israel. So too when it comes to an illness, of a war that the illness is lying in wait. This could be a mitzvah war. And if we would merit that all would be done to combat it according to the Torah, perhaps a court would see the need to test medicines as a mitzvah war of saving lives. Therefore, in our day, even though it is not done according to Torah law, meaning the scientists aren't working to Torah, right? They're working to science. Still, it is done by great experts with great care. Logically, there is no prohibition against volunteering for this. This, I'm suggesting based on what he's saying, and this is why it's so important to have these discussions, because we can understand the godless of what he's saying is, it's a mitzvah to participate in a vaccine trial. Not just is it ethically possible, it's a mitzvah. Now, which is fascinating, because everything we said until now, it's still putting yourself at risk. It's still dangerous, yet if you are a person that could fall into the category, and we trust, as he says, that the scientists and the doctors and the medical experts are taking great care, as we hope they are, because then, as we said, in order to be part of the studies, a person has to be low risk, and then a key part of this is likely to get it anyway. If you live in northwest London, all right, in Golders Green, Edgware, Stamford Hill, Nocha Belmont, right? If you live in a community and you know that most of us would have been exposed to COVID over the last 18 months, even if you had symptoms or didn't have symptoms, I imagine most of us had, because we're community people. We interact with each other in large numbers. So it goes around. So all of us would be in a situation where we are likely to get COVID anyway. So if we put it into that box, you're likely to get COVID. If, please God, you're a healthy person, therefore not susceptible to being affected adversely or seriously by actually getting COVID, it becomes a mitzvah. And the final question I suppose we can ask, which we're going to look at now, is, can you coerce someone? Can you coerce someone? If a king calls you up, okay, so you're protecting the government, but can a halachic authority, can a Beth Din, can a local authority coerce someone in? Would it be ethically possible, taking out of the halakha for a second, would it be ethically possible for Harrow Council to write to all the residents of Harrow to say, we need 100 people to volunteer? And if we don't get 100 volunteers, we are going to legally require a pool of healthy people, 100 people, and we're going to just say you have to do it or you're going to go to prison. Would that be ethical for them to do? I don't think so, right? But could you argue that there's a need for a greater need for society to get a vaccine, that they have to do this? You could argue that there maybe is a reason that, in the same, how is that different from conscription in Israel? Every 18-year-old, unless they can prove that they can't fight or for whatever reason, is conscripted into the army. And many of them, their lives are going to be put in danger. So what's the difference from the local authority demanding that you have to, a small amount of the borough has to go to COVID trials? It's an interesting conversation to have. I can see that, some of you are a bit tired, so we're going to have to go into it now, right? But it's a lot of pashtuts. So in terms of the coercion, there is a fascinating, we're going to skip over, there's a halacha here. There's so many different sources you go. I'm going to go to the last source. This is source number 10. The principle is Hatzalah Derabim, right? We're talking about saving people for the greater good, for the greater cause. But there's a Yerushalmi that says like this: if groups of people were traveling on the road and they encountered non-Jews or a group of bandits, let's just say, who said, give us one of yours and we're going to kill him, or we're going to kill all of you. Think about the question. You're a group of people, Belmont community, let's not use our own, it's not very nice. I think about a particular group from a particular shul is going on a trip, and they encounter bandits, and they said, we need one of you. You send out whoever you want. We're going to kill that one person, or we're all going to kill all of you. Are you allowed to give up that one person? So what would you naturally say? I ain't going to be the person that's going to give him up. right? I'm not going to, God forbid, take me, whatever it is, right? So what's the Gemara say? Then, even if all of them will be killed, they may not surrender a single life of Israel, okay? If the attackers, however, designated one person, the Gemara says like Sheva bin Bichri. Sheva bin Bichri was someone that fought with David, who was going to be sentenced to death anyway. They surrender him in order not to be killed. And the Gemara speaks about, if that person is going to die anyway, you're allowed to surrender him, which is a fascinating conversation to have in of itself. But simply put, and the reason why it's important to talk about is, when it comes for the sake of the community, there are levels of risk that one can take over and above what one might take for themselves. And therefore, there are expectations upon the individuals to take those risks on behalf of the community, but all the time, bearing in mind, we have to have sensitivities to what halakha teaches us. And halakha teaches us the sanctity of life, the preservation of life, not being frivolous when it comes to medications and treatments that aren't grounded in due diligence and care and concern from doctors and experts that know what they're doing, and understanding all the balances and understanding all the understanding all the various sensitivities that go with all of that. So, with the conclusion here is from the quite a bit of research I did and how I presented it today. We're talking about individual, and then the community, the sensitivity the Torah has to it. But really, and my favorite really was the Pesach Halakha from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who likens the illness or the fight against disease to a war, and how we can compel a society to a mitzvah war, and we reflect that back to people who volunteered to help with medications and treatments, it actually being a mitzvah war, and therefore it's a mitzvah to partake in such a thing. And so Barbara, you have to relate that back to David, that it's a Kiddush Hashem. Oh, he's still there because it's a mitzvah, but not for the reasons you said, but for the reasons because you have to follow the halachic journey a little bit. There are millions of different things we could read and talk about. We had Rabbi Moshe Freeman back in, I think it was January, talk about vaccinations and about some of the comments that were made around just vaccinations. But this was about not taking the vaccinations. This was about putting oneself at risk in order to get the science for those vaccinations. Any questions? Anything I didn't discuss properly? I mean, we basically got our feet wet into a few different topics. We can't possibly cover everything. We do a whole series on this. Dr. Frosch.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. That was very, very nice. I know not a lot more than probably most people on this call certainly about challenge vaccination challenge trials. Well, I'm interested in that context, and maybe you can help me out. If there is a monetary gain from taking part, how does that change the ethics? Because certainly these are in Britain, I believe people are not offered payment for this. I don't know about in the States in terms of taking part in challenge trials, but any trial like that where people are offered money, it's like the Americans who used to pay their blood donors, which ended up, I'm afraid, with a serious part to play in the AIDS epidemic. It was in America. It was in America. And so I'm just interested to know, is that part of the equation that you can talk about? And if somebody is dangling a maybe not so altruistic outcome there, but if somebody is in poverty and needs the money, maybe they would go forward and take part in the trial if there was monetary gain.
Fascinating. Anyone want to comment before I do?
Well, that goes on, unfortunately, with organ donation into poor countries where people do say, take one of my kidneys, I need money to keep my family, which is totally immoral and on behalf of the authorities or the doctors or whatever. And you feel terribly sorry for the people who feel they have to go down that road in order to survive, which is absolutely awful. So it's a similar sort of thing, really, isn't it? Okay.
So I'm digesting what you said and thinking how to answer it. And I'm also thinking about, like, forgetting this topic, just when is it unethical to pay for any mitzvah? Because what we're doing is we're saying, potentially, according to Rav Auerbach, this is a mitzvah. And can you pay someone to do a mitzvah? Is that what you're asking? Or you're
Does it stop being a mitzvah if you get paid for it? This is the thing.
Is that what you're asking? Does it stop being a mitzvah if you're paid for it? You don't know.
Yes, I suppose that is what I'm saying. But I mean, does that mean I'm not getting a mitzvah for teaching this shir? Can you? See, I'm what they call Nogea B'Davar, right? Because I'm thinking, right, so I do mitzvahs every day and I get paid for some of them. So, like, I'm thinking now. It's talking, I suppose, in a way about your comments about coercion. And the same ethics goes towards, can you coerce people to have the vaccine at all in order for them to travel abroad? They've got to be coerced into it. Do they have to have the vaccination in order to work in care homes or within the NHS? And there's a big topic there about coercing people to have, like, and you know, what I personally feel about it is irrelevant here is what is the ethics behind that. It's a big topic generally, not just on the Jewish scale, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying, and now I'm understanding your question a bit clearer. I think it needs a lot of thought, because, you know, like, you know, the articles about providing cholent and kugel on a Thursday night down in some of the Jewish hubs just to bring them out to get vaccinated, and demanding vaccine passports for travel, for entertainment, and therefore basically telling people that don't want to be vaccinated, if you don't vaccinate, we're going to make your life very, very difficult, which is a sense of coercion. However, is that coercion for the good of the country and the good and the safety of people? Could we even say, noch, enforcing mask wearing in shul when it wasn't a legal requirement for the safety of our members? Not quite coercion, because you don't have to come. But if you want to come in, we've changed now for various reasons. But if you wanted to come in on Rosh Hashanah, we wanted you to wear a mask. And if you weren't going to wear a mask, we didn't want you to come. So we are, I think what you're saying is it's a fascinating topic, and the government's dealing with it now. And yes, it has many ethical consequences to it, but needs a lot more thought than I can give it on one foot now. And definitely a conversation that we could try and have, maybe from some ethical experts as well. But this could be a very fascinating. I think Barbara has just volunteered to put an evening together of experts in the field on ethics to talk about how ethical and can governments be in order to coerce people into taking the vaccine. And maybe that's a different topic to what we discussed tonight, but maybe something we should be looking into, because it's fascinating and very relevant for many of us. I could tell you now that I am desperate to go to Israel, like so many of you. My brother had a baby daughter which had many complications to it, and I can't go now because my second vaccine has expired from the 6 months. So if I want to go, I'm Israeli, so I can get into Israel. But if I want to go, I'd have to go into bidud, isolation for at least a week, if not longer, unless I get the third vaccine, the booster. But I'm only 40. So is it ethically, am I allowed to try and jump the queue to go and get into Israel? And I don't think I would do that. I don't think I deserve it just because I want to go and see my new niece and my brother I haven't seen for 2 years. But there's an interesting conversation around the ethics behind pushing in line to get the vaccine. And, you know, why? For personal, I'm not even concerned because I'm not even concerned that I want to be healthy from the vaccine. I just want to go to Israel. Now, personally, I wouldn't push the queue. If someone offered it to me, that's different. But I wouldn't I wouldn't try and do it just to get into Israel. But apparently, and I'm not going to comment on this. I don't know anything about it, but I have been told for those people that were testing to go abroad, you can get all different types of blood, and there's a black market of if you want. Did you want to have COVID 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago? Do you want to have never? As in, you can buy stuff in order to take the test. I mean, it's the whole, that is prohibited, that is not ethical, that is illegal, it is in every kind of never ever do such a thing, but it happens, and it's very wrong. And unfortunately, fortunately, we've seen the very best of society over the last 18 months and some of the worst of how people have behaved.
Rabbi, if it's been 6 months since your second vaccination, which is like I was 6 months after my second, I've now had my booster. So you had it early to start with. You must have done, if you're only, because you're considerably younger than me.
I had my
you must have had it early to start with.
At the beginning of May. So
well, I had mine in the beginning of April. So you're not quite 6 months there yet.
No, but when I was
you can go to Grimsdyke Golf Club Vaccination Centre. If you've got 6 months after your second vaccine, you just walk in. It's a walk-in centre.
Then you can't go unless you're within the age group, or unless you are high risk, or you're a social care or healthcare worker. You have to be within one of the groups. So I think I could probably persuade them that he's an essential worker.
Yeah.
You can't just walk in.
They told me when I was there that as long as you had 6 months, I mean, I was qualified only because of my age and the 6 months. Yeah. You had 6 months, but after because you must have had it for a reason earlier to start with, because you must have, to get that to that 6 month stage, you must have been vaccinated.
Not always. We were vaccinated people to use up vaccine. I've been doing quite well.
Right. Okay, stand corrected. Sorry. I was just trying to help. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. I just booked my flight while you're talking.
I'm afraid you're just going to have to go into Bidud for a week at the moment, because they would,
No, don't worry about me. It was more the point of can you put the ethical discussion of can you push in front. I think the next topic I'm going to look at, nothing to do with this. In 2 weeks, I'm doing the next one. I am away next week, hopefully, but in 2 weeks, in the next one, hoping it does every other week. But the dates will be published in next week as all the dates we're going to do for November and December. I'm interested in looking at the topic of can you defend someone who is guilty? So can a lawyer knowingly defend someone knowing that they are guilty of the crime? And I'm interested in, I have no idea what the halakha would say about such a thing. So I'm interested in looking at that topic as an ethical issue. But if you have any topics that you think might be of ethical interest and you'd like me to look into, then please feel free to share. I've got some ideas what I'd like to cover between medical stuff, business stuff, other stuff as well. So be in touch. Thank you for joining. Thank you for participating. I hope that was of interest. And have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very, very good.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.